I want to take some time and show you some examples here of some photos that I shot and explain what my ISO was, what my focal length was, my f-stop, and my shutter. So just to give you some ideas here and look at what's in focus, what's not in focus. Don't get caught up so much in the pictures. Start analyzing them. Is there a large depth of field? Is there a very shallow depth of field? How close was I to the subject? So in this case, this was shot with ISO 200, and you can see I have my settings up at the top. It's always a good idea when you present your photos for this class to put those settings there. It not only will help me see what you did, but it will also help yourself learn what worked, what didn't work. What photo do you end up thinking, wow, that color is just perfect in that situation? Do that again. Add that to your cheat sheet. So ISO 200, it was outdoors, obviously in a very sunny day. The focal length here was 214 millimeters, and I shot the aperture at 5.7, shutter speed at 400. So you can see that, as far as the depth of field, it is not super narrow, but the trees in the background are indeed blurred. The next example I want to show you here has a little bit higher ISO at 320, the focal length at 250, the f-stop at 7.1, and shutter at 400. So if I do a comparable here of the previous, notice the focal length fairly close from 214 to 250. The f-stop here, my aperture, is 5.7 on this one, and this one moves to 7.1. Do you notice anything different? Not much. Distance from the subject, pretty close. So those slight changes aren't really doing a whole lot. On to the next example. So here are the ISOs at 250. My focal length is at 250. Aperture is at 5.7 and shutter at 400. So you can see that distance, we're staying the same. The quality of focus on the giraffe itself staying the same. The blurriness of the background, that depth of field distance, pretty much staying the same. And you can see how playing with that depth of field, not having those trees be in focus, helps to bring the giraffe out. It makes the giraffe be my subject. It brings it in focus. Those blurred trees help to really emphasize it's not a distraction at all. The next couple photos here, again, comparables. So this one has an ISO of 640. The focal length is at 96, so I'm a little bit closer. The aperture is at 5, shutter's at 125. So this is a relatively small focal length. This one has a larger focal length, so this is at 250. So we're talking about from 96 to 250. Do you see the difference? I'm the same distance away. I did not sneak in and come up close. I'm the same distance. So you can see what's happening here. Now with this f-stop at 5, not only is my little friend here in focus, but look at the rocks behind. It takes quite a distance there before they start to become blurred. The rocks in front, very much still in focus. So you can see that depth of field isn't very, very shallow. It's not extremely wide because I do have some blurring happening way far there. If you look in the top left, you can see that those rocks are starting to blur out. But it's working fairly well. Now when I go closer, look how soon those rocks blur out. So it's all on the focal length, my higher focal length. So that's something that some of you can control with your cameras. If you can't control the aperture, you can control the focal length. For my aperture is just about the same, from a 5 to a 5.7. So it's all about the focal length here that's changing that depth of field. My next friend that I visited. So again, a series here that we're going to look at. So in this case, my ISO was at 160, so it was very bright. The focal length at 250. My aperture was at 7.1, and again, my shutter at 400. So one of the things here that you probably don't even realize, you see a cage or fence in the background. Did you know there was a fence in the front as well? I shot through the fence. What happened is when I used my telephoto lens, so my focal length, I've got 250 millimeter, and I was able to shoot through the fence without you seeing the fence. It blurred it out to the point where you don't see it. So when you're taking a photo of animals, say at the zoo, and there's bars or fences that are in front that get in the way, what should you do? Get your lens set to telephoto, or put your telephoto lens on. This was 250 again. Choose AV mode, where the aperture is as wide as possible, and what will happen is the camera does some compensations, but we want to hold the aperture as wide as we possibly can, get close to the fence, and then snap the photo, and that fence will go away. So that's pretty cool, a very cool tip that you can do. So again, if we look at this, the stats here on this photo, the ISO again was at 160, focal length at 250, and my aperture at 7.1. If I go to the next one here, ISO's at 160, focal length at 250, and shutter at 7.1. So we're looking at exactly the same photo, and you can see exactly the same results. I want you to notice that behind there's some bricks or rocks, and they are exactly the same as far as focusing. Okay, so let's change to a different subject. Here are some floral. This ISO was at 400. My focal length a little bit closer at 116. The aperture at 5, shutter at 200. So look again at that depth of field. So with a 5, we're still blurring out that background, but notice that my focal length is probably playing a little bit of role in here as well. Another example where my focal length is even smaller. So my ISO's at 200. Again, it was a bright sunny day. My focal length at 96, and I was pretty close to that subject. The aperture at 5. In this case, the focal length at 146, so I was zoomed in a bit more. And the shutter at 5.6. And what's cool about this is you can see that my main flower in front is in focus. Quickly, the flower that was directly behind it is out of focus. The bee coming in, but not crisp at all because of that depth of field. So this has a very shallow depth of field. So even though that my aperture is not way down, it's not, or I could say maxed wide open, that would be around a 2.8. I'm kind of middle ground here, but dealing with my focal length and my distance from the subject, I was able to get a very shallow depth of field. Couple more examples for you here. So here's another example with even a more shallow depth of field. Notice how only the middle of the cookie is in focus. The front and the back are thrown out of focus. So this has an ISO of 400. It was shot indoors under incandescent lighting. I don't believe there was any daylight coming in at all. The focal length here is 55. So I have something that's, very small for my focal length, and the aperture was at 5.6. But again, my distance from the subject was very close. I was very, very close to this cookie. So I was able to achieve a very shallow depth of field. If you know, this cookie is only a couple inches wide, and I was able to achieve the depth of field of focus of less than an inch probably. So I was able to get very close to the cookie. Aperture's not high, but it's not low. So that means it's not wide open, and it was a very short focal length. One more example, again, ISO at 400, focal length at 55, aperture at 5.7. In this case, the shutter's at 60, so it's very, very slow. So I had to anchor. And put my camera on the table, on an object, so that I would not get any blurring occurring. And again, you can see that the area of focus is right there in the front, and it quickly becomes, before mid-cookie, out of focus. So what you have to remember with all of this dealing with photography, it's part techniques, part art. Techniques meaning it'll tell us the depth of field, how we can adjust it. So you either fill the screen with my object by walking up to that subject, or you back off and zoom in. And I think I showed you a couple examples of each way. So both of those ways can achieve depth of field. So you're not only dealing with the aperture, you're dealing with your focal length and you're dealing with your distance from the subject. I want you to remember that. A lot of people tend to think that because their camera doesn't have a setting that they can't change the f-stops, they're not able to get a good depth of field. You can play with it and you can achieve it. Any tool can do that. And then part art. By this, we're talking about the artistic way of not only composing your photos, but how you are achieving these different techniques. For instance, a long lens, a long focal length reduces the distance from the subject and then thus provides a shallow depth of field. Again, I showed you some examples that had a very large focal length and that also achieved a depth of field. So techniques and arts, between that and photography, we get different results. And so key thing, think about, just because you don't have an aperture setting, you might have a longer lens that provides a more flattened perspective, which makes a narrow depth of field much more prominent than walking closer to the subject and using a lens with a normal focal length. So a lot of ways that you can play around with your depth of field.